the wildfire recovery. So I think there may be some overlap in that FIP.
Thanks, Eric. Well, good morning, everybody. It looks like we're live streaming. So, and you're right. It looks like we have a great turnout. Meg, Lindsay, Brenda, Stephen, the Dans, Gary, the Right Honorable Jamie McLeod Skinner. Boy, I haven't heard your name for ages.
Well done, Jamie.
Indeed.
Way to go, Jamie.
Mhm.
So,
Thank you all for, I think, congratulating me on my birthday. You all on a live stream for OWEB.
Right, right.
So, Stephanie, are we waiting for Kathy McDonald?
Yep, we are waiting for Kathy. I'll text her just to make sure, because as far as I know, as of yesterday, she was planning to join us. So let me text her real quick, and then I think we could maybe go ahead to one of the other agenda items if you would like while we wait. But first I'll grab my phone and text her.
All right. Well, I think we only have a 5 item agenda, however, and 4 of them are reports. And then one pretty major discussion item on priorities and intersectionality. So while we're waiting, Stephanie, if you want to pick one of the other reports to present, I think that'd be a good way to start.
Great. Let's see, why don't we could go ahead to why don't I do the drought programs, actually, since you were just asking about that, Bruce. Can I text Kathy really quick before I start talking, though? I don't want to try and multitask because I know that I can't. So let me send just a very quick text message.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll ask kind of poll the rest of the committee and ask if there's anything else on their minds they would like to add to the agenda so we can get it on the table.
And Bruce, while we're waiting for folks to think about that, just want to, of course, welcome everyone to the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board Climate and Water Committee. We've, earlier this year, OWEB combined and consolidated some of our committees. So this is an opportunity to talk about a series of both climate and water related issues. Really fortunate to have a bunch of outstanding staff and OWEB members on this committee. And then per Bruce's comments, what we're looking at today, for those of you who don't have an agenda in front of them, and I'm wondering, April, if you're able to share in the comments for those who are either joining us on YouTube or those who may be part of this meeting, to share the agenda. And what we're looking at, the 5 items that Bruce mentioned, were an update from the Oregon Global Warming Commission, and that's what Stephanie's checking on now, discussing the committee priorities and intersectionality between committees, which comes up because OWEB has several committees, and we don't want to, while we're focused on water climate, don't want to let go of the importance and priority of incorporating things like DEI into our discussions. Also get a couple other updates on the climate resolution and some of those listening sessions, and then some communication on follow-up on climate resolution stakeholders and tribal engagement, and then the drought program update that was mentioned. So for those who are watching don't have that in front of it, that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today. And with that, I'll throw it back over to you, Stephanie, or you, Bruce.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, Stephanie, do you want to make an introduction?
Sure. Good morning. First of all, good morning, everybody, and good morning, Kathy. I'm very excited to have Kathy Mcdonald joining us, the chair of the Oregon Global Warming Commission. So she's here to provide an update this morning on several topics related to natural and working lands carbon sequestration goals for Oregon. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Apologies for being a little bit late. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. So I think you'll have to unshare your screen. Well, I guess I can do it myself. There we go. Put this in presentation mode. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to give you kind of an update on our natural and working lands proposal. I thought I would start by giving you a reminder overview of what we adopted last August, and then kind of talk about some of the things that are in the works, have been in the works since that time. And so, as I think you all know, the governor directed the Oregon Global Warming Commission to develop a proposal for how to increase carbon sequestration and storage in Oregon's natural and working lands as part of her Executive Order 20-04. And we worked closely with Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, as well as ODA, ODF, and DLCD on developing the proposal. As well as engaged a broad set of Oregonians in that work. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Just to kind of remind you about what's in the proposal broadly, we talked about the importance of paying attention to the land sector as part of a comprehensive approach to climate mitigation. We identified principles for natural and working land strategies, identified goals and metrics, and strategies for reaching those goals. At the onset, we identified a set of principles for the work to develop the proposal. We wanted to make sure that our process was inclusive and transparent. We wanted to make sure that all the information was based on the best available science, and then that any goals and strategies that we identified would provide meaningful climate benefits, would prioritize benefits to climate impacted communities, would incorporate land manager and community interests, and ensure that access to any programs could be made by a diversity of land managers in the state, and that we would think a lot about the co-benefits of those actions. So those were kind of the principles that we set out, and those were reinforced by the public input that we got. We had an extensive public input process. The Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board was hugely important to the commission in making sure that that happened. The commission has got very limited staff. We have a 0.3 FTE staffing at the Oregon Department of Energy, and they are generous beyond that, but we would not have been able to do the great work that we were able to do in terms of public involvement without the help of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. We did targeted land manager surveys. We had a broad survey. We did focused discussions across the state and across sectors. And all of that input that we received through those efforts, which included more than 1,000 Oregonians, what were used to really influence the proposal. We established a vision, and that was important because we wanted to make sure we were kind of headed toward the right North Star. And that was that we weren't going to just think about doing as much as we can to increase sequestration, but really think about the importance of having a resilient and robust carbon or climate sink in our natural and working lands. And just recognizing the complexities around especially forest management and fire, and some of the resilience work that needs to be done to reduce some of the uncharacteristically severe fires that we've been seeing in our forests. So that recognition that we need to really balance those things was really important. We did identify an outcome-based goal, and that was based on some research that was done by a variety of organizations and input from technical experts. We think we can have an additional 5 million metric tons of carbon in Oregon's natural and working lands by 2030 and 9.5 million metric tons by 2050. Originally, we had anticipated that we would be able to measure that against an inventory of natural and working lands following the methodologies that the EPA uses. The inventory, there is enough complexity in the inventory and we need to improve the data in the inventory that we determined that that's probably not the best way for us to measure progress. And so we identified the need for activity-based metrics and an activity-based baseline. So things like acres of adopted soil health practices, riparian reforestation, urban canopy expansion, things like that, that would help us track progress towards our goals. And then we got, because of the principles that we set and the amount of public interest that we heard about equity, we identified the need to also have community impact metrics to make sure that the programs that are designed and managed pay attention to equity issues, pay attention to triple bottom line outcomes. And so those were identified as needs to kind of form a foundation for this work. And then the proposal has 4 really high level strategies for natural and working lands. One, kind of making sure that we're thinking about working closely with our federal land partners, land managing agencies, as Oregon has a good history of doing, and thinking about both the federal lands and the federal investments that are coming through the bipartisan infrastructure bill and other efforts at the federal level. Second, to, in the long run, identify a sustained source of state funding to increase sequestration and storage. We identified the need to make sure that the agencies are directed and have funding to advance a number of more specific strategies for increasing sequestration. And then finally, that we need to make investments to improve the natural and working lands inventory and research. Relative to the funding for the agencies and direction to the agencies, we identified a number of specific recommendations under that, focused on land use planning, around soil health and agricultural land protection efforts. We identified a number of forest management recommendations, including urban and non-urban forests, and then a focus in on our coastal estuarine wetlands and some strategies for advancing that. And finally, one of the things that we heard over and over again, and I imagine is front of mind for OWEB, is the need for additional technical assistance for landowners if we are going to really make big changes in how we're thinking about managing land. We're going to need to provide landowners with enough technical assistance support to make sure that, and training programs to make sure that we can adopt these kinds of changes in management. So that was adopted in August. We had the opportunity during the short session to introduce a bill, Senate Bill 1534, that would have set some of the foundation for this work, including defining natural and working lands in statute, declaring that the state should advance natural and working land strategy as a part of a comprehensive climate protection program, climate mitigation program, and then directing the Oregon Global Warming Commission to create a natural and working lands advisory group to continue our interest in maintaining a inclusive and transparent process for thinking through how to design programs and develop programs. It would have directed the Institute for Natural Resources to support the commission in developing the metrics and baselines that I mentioned earlier, and advancing and improving a land sector inventory and completing a workforce and economic development study that I mentioned. So that kind of foundational pieces of that. And then finally, it would direct agencies to be able to report to the commission so that we can consolidate that and make sure that the legislature knows how we're doing against our goals for climate mitigation. That bill was, we were not able to pass that in the short session. It's pretty hard to pass a new idea in a short session, but we did get quite a bit of support and discussion about it. But unfortunately, we didn't make it across the finish line. We were able to pivot, and we submitted a proposal to the U.S. Climate Alliance to help us not do everything that we had wanted to do as part of Senate Bill 1534, but to do the things that are really critical as a foundation. And so it would create the natural and working lands, the follow-on work and the funding from the U.S. Climate Alliance, along with some additional funding from NRCS, are going to help us create a natural and working lands advisory group, develop the metrics, both activity metrics and the baseline for those metrics, which OWEB will be very important in terms of making sure that we can look at the data that you have been collecting through your history. It would allow us to develop those community impact metrics, as well as develop kind of a scope of work for both improving the inventory and developing that workforce and economic development study. So we have just gotten the first piece of that funding nailed down, and we are planning to bring together the advisory committee in August. The commission will be talking about kind of how we're thinking about going about creating that advisory group at our July 13th meeting. And then hopefully we'll be able to impanel that advisory group soon thereafter. I've been working with, and the Institute for Natural Resources will be doing staffing this work for the commission as we had anticipated in the Senate bill. And we'll have a interagency core team, including OWEB, to make sure that we're complementing all the great work that other agencies are doing around these topics, and not duplicating efforts, but just complementing that work and incorporating the good thinking that you and others have been doing around the land sector and how to go about doing this work. So with that, I'll stop and happy to take any questions about what we're working on.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, do we have any questions from the members?
I have one if no one else does. And just want to preface my question by saying thank you so much. What a remarkable report and the work being done. Also really appreciate OWEB staff stepping and helping out on these joint goals. As you well know, Catherine, one of the things that OWEB is also doing is we're trying to, this thing about metrics is so important. We got to know what we're measuring in order to do it. And so that work that you've done, so our thanks to the commission, that is really helpful in getting us started. So there was that piece. I guess you had mentioned some of the opportunities for federal investments. You mentioned the sequestration, storage, agency funding, the working lands inventory and research. Are there other ideas or other thoughts that have come up as opportunities to get support from the federal government on some of these efforts?
Well, in addition to the infrastructure bill, there's still some discussion about a Build Back Better bill that potentially could go through. That would have significant additional funding. The infrastructure bill, one of the biggest pieces there is funding for increasing reforestation on federal lands through what had been a standalone bill called the Replant Act, but this will increase the amount of funding that goes to the Reforestation Trust Fund. And so the Forest Service will be able to increase the infrastructure for reforestation as well as the actual work to be done on the ground. So that's one of the big pieces there. And certainly if Build Back Better went through, there are a number of additional elements of work. There's the work that that could be coming through the grant proposal that the Department of Agriculture had submitted to the Climate Smart Commodities program that I know is pending, and I understand that OWEB may be implicated in helping to manage that if it does come through. There's a grant proposal deadline that states and tribes are eligible for at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for America the Beautiful investments and ecosystem restoration. So those are some of the things that I'm aware of that are potentially available to the state for advancing this kind of work.
Thank you.
Meg?
Thank you, Bruce. And Catherine, thank you for joining us today and for that presentation, which was
Absolutely.
very helpful. I'm exposing my ignorance here, I'm sure, but it got me thinking about with the kind of forest production or forest management sector versus the agricultural sector. I kind of have them in two different baskets, and I realize I don't have clear thoughts about the type of activities we'd be looking for from the agricultural sector on this front. And I'm not looking for a list. I just mean kind of some categorical description of what kinds of things we would be interested in.
Absolutely. They range from things like cover crops and changes in management practices that increase soil carbon to things like silvopasture, where you can plant trees in pasture lands that provide some benefits, a wide range of benefits, alley cropping or alley management, where you kind of plant trees on the edges of fields. So those are some of the things that can be.
Okay, that makes sense. I have one other question that's quick. I was wondering if we could get a copy of your slides.
Sure,
because
yeah.
We're all reporting back to our places from whence we came, and it'll be helpful to have that. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Happy to send it. Yeah.
Thanks, Meg. Gary?
Thanks, Bruce. Kathy, what great work. That's a great report. So I just have a question about the baseline that was problematic. What were the issues with establishing where the
inventory?
The inventory, and what do you see going forward? I know locally here and in our research center over in Eastern Oregon, Dr. Tony Svekar has been doing work on this for years.
Absolutely.
And so I was just wondering, where we're at on that information and what do you see going forward from here?
Yeah, great question. So there are a couple of challenges with the inventory. The current methods that the EPA uses for establishing the national inventory, the information is they have a methodology and they do have a tool that will downsize that methodology to a state level, but it's complicated, and the information that's available at the state level doesn't really reflect all the good information that we would have if we could build something with Oregon-based information. And a couple of the different challenges, there isn't a lot of information on soil carbon on agricultural lands or any lands, but because that's such an important piece of the puzzle on agricultural lands, there isn't a good comprehensive approach to soil carbon in agricultural lands, similar or as compared to the carbon information that you can derive from the forest inventory and analysis data that's been collected for nearly 20 years now in forest ecosystems. So that's one of the challenges that, we do have some great Oregon information. I think Tony Svekar's work absolutely, has contributed to that, but there isn't a good system of data, spatially explicit data that relative to Oregon to kind of feed into that. And then on the forest side, while we have better information about forests, the way that the data is collected from the forest inventory plots and the way that we collect the wood products storage information, they kind of are different enough that and I found some inconsistencies between a study that Oregon Department of Forestry did for Oregon versus what you would get if you use this EPA tool. And I wasn't able to resolve and understand those differences, but obviously we would want to go with what ODF did, but we just couldn't get it resolved in time. And then I think there's some important, it would be important to have some better spatial data to help inform the inventory over time so that we can kind of attribute some of the change to the broader landscape and the changes happening in the broader landscape outside of the plots. And then finally, on the blue carbon, we've got a great Pacific Northwest blue carbon working group that has been operating for the last several years to build better information on the carbon associated with estuaries and coastal habitats. And we were able to pull some of that information into the inventory, but we just didn't have time to sync it all up and then think through what additional information would be helpful. So there's some need to think about the best remote sensing information and some need to kind of figure out some of the differences and how we should be thinking about the forest, and then a lot of need for additional soil carbon data.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. Yeah, it's we're getting there, right? Yeah.
We are, yeah.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Stephanie. Stephanie, you had your hand up next.
Oh, I did. Thanks, Bruce. I just wanted to mention to the committee that as part of our current biennium spending plan, OWEB's got the line item on governor's priorities. And one of the funded projects under that is with Dr. Marcus Kleber at OSU's Soil Health Lab. He has received some NRCS funding over the last few years and now funding from us to start working on that, not just soil carbon, but baseline of soil health around the states, get existing data sets entered into a user-friendly system and make that information more accessible. So I completely agree with Kathy on the lack of soil carbon data. That's been a challenge for many years, but just wanted to mention that we're funding some work to help round out the data that are available.
And he was one of the experts that we consulted as we were trying to put together the proposal.
Thanks, Stephanie. Jamie?
Yeah, sorry, a follow-up that was prompted by Gary's question about forestry management. And I know with regard to forestry management around fire protection, there's a lot of conflicting perspectives on how best to do that. Catherine, you were talking more about data collection, but are you also rolling out ideas and perspectives on forestry management that would tie over into forestry into wildfire practices, or is that something that you're not addressing at this point?
One of the recommendations does talk about the need for forest resilience treatments, and the fact that while that will have a short-term impact on carbon stocks, depending on where you are in the state, and how much of an increase in fire we think there's going to be over time, it should provide some landscape scale benefits from doing those treatments. But that's certainly a complex issue and needs to be thought through. And needs to start with thinking about how we make communities safe, looking right at the communities, but also how we think about the broader landscape. So the recommendation does include a recommendation around wildfire management.
No, thank you. I anticipate we'll all be having a lot of additional questions around that, trying to figure out bringing in traditional practices and how to do both those. So thank you.
Absolutely. And the work that's being done through Senate Bill 762, certainly it's going to be on the leading edge of that discussion.
Thank you. Brenda?
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Relative to Jamie's question, there was an excellent webinar provided by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a few weeks ago that did address exactly that question, and the fact that you can have greater long-term carbon storage if you increase the resistance of the forest to catastrophic fire and keep low-intensity fire in the forest. The long-term benefits are greater, whereas on the west side of the Cascades, it's a very different story. And I think the message here is that you have different approaches in different forest types and forest ecosystems. There's not a one-size-fits-all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brendan. And that was a phenomenal webinar. I have a couple quick ones. First, where are you on the mapping tool that I think the commission talked about, or maybe I'm getting them confused. Vulnerable, traditionally underrepresented communities. That was a product that was supposed to come out.
Yeah, my understanding, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, is that that's something that DEQ and others are
Okay.
focusing in on, as well as I think work that DLCD is leading in terms of getting public input on that. The community impact metrics, I think, can be informed by some of that work, and then I think there'll be some other issues that we might want to be paying attention to as part of a set of metrics that we think about when we design programs. And I'm anticipating that the agencies, and in particular, that OWEB will have a lot to offer in how to really think about the best way to design programs to promote equity and also ensure that we're getting those triple bottom line outputs, because I know that's been an important thing for OWEB for a number of years.
Yeah, thank you. And my last question is, I believe Stephanie sent it to you, and I think I might have earlier. Our board resolution on climate, which also has some DEI information in it as well. If you've had a chance to read it, I'm curious your reaction. Did we miss anything? Are our perspectives correct? Anything we can do better?
I thought it was great. I'm excited that you guys have adopted that. I think it's, as someone that was involved in passing the measure that established OWEB, I think it's entirely consistent with the constitutional language and recognizes that connection between the need to improve the health of and protect biodiversity and the kind of establishing considerations for the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board and that strong connection between the potential impacts of climate on achieving those outcomes for our natural and working lands. So I highly commend you for putting that through, and I think it's entirely consistent with the work. I couldn't think of anything that I thought was missing. So thank you for doing that.
Thanks, Catherine. Seeing no more questions, thank you very much for the presentation, and hopefully it'll continue on the communication. And I know Jesse's bringing that all back, and I understand you still have a couple openings. If any members know of good people to help the commission, so thank you again.
Thank you. Appreciated being invited, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Now, Stephanie, where would you like to go next? You want to do the reports, or do you want to go to the discussion?
I'm fine with going to the discussion, Mr. Co-Chair, however you prefer. I think we're prepared to tackle any of the items, so we can go in order if you'd like.
My only concern is thinking that there may be something coming from the reports that might inform the discussion.
Okay, certainly. Sure, in that case, would you like to go to item number 3 in the outreach on the climate resolution?
I think that's perfect.
Great. All right.
Okay, that's me. Hi, everybody. This is Jessie Kirshner joining by phone, Water and Climate Programs Coordinator. So I'm going to be sharing a bit about the public engagement process that we went through. And then since I am on the phone, I'll turn to Stephanie and Eric to help with fielding questions, and I'll do what I can. But just to give you an overview, so we held 6 virtual public listening sessions in April and May. We had almost 80 unique participants attend those public listening sessions. So some of those participants attended multiple sessions. We did have participants from all 6 of OWEB's regions, with the most coming from Region 3 in the Willamette Valley, and the fewest coming from Region 6 or the Mid-Columbia region. Participants primarily represented watershed councils, soil and water conservation districts, and nonprofit organizations, but we did have other attendees from local government, tribes, federal and state agencies, and we had private businesses. So some of those on the ground implementers and contractors that we wanted to attend also attended those public listening sessions. The vast majority of those who attended identified their role as an executive director or coordinator or a project or program manager. And we also held a tribal listening session in early May. We had representatives from 8 of 10 tribes attend, and there were multiple representatives from each tribe that were in attendance. I think except for one, there's multiple people from each of the tribes that was there. And then we also had that online survey that was open from mid-March until early June. It covered the same content as the listening sessions, with some additional material and questions, particularly targeting the 2 DEI bullet points in the climate resolution. We had 44 responses to that survey, and it was anonymous. And then also Eric Hartstein and I had some separate one-on-one conversations with external partners and agency partners as well. And then I won't be sharing it here, but the consultant that we've been working with for the DEI trainings, Echo Northwest, they did those interviews with the non-traditional partners and have provided a report to us with some information and feedback that they received related to the climate resolution as well. So in the listening sessions, we asked specific questions about challenges and opportunities with integrating emissions reductions, carbon sequestration and storage, and adaptation and resilience into projects. We asked participants to provide some insight into what OWEB can do to help grant applicants build these kinds of climate considerations into their projects. And then we also asked them to give us one important thing that we need to be thinking about as we consider rulemaking related to the climate resolution. And so I mentioned that the survey had these same kinds of questions. And I'm just going to present a couple of the major themes that we heard. I'm not going to go into great detail on this because we have a summary report that we'll be providing to you in a couple of weeks that has a lot more information. But some of the things that we heard, one of the big things was that there's a big desire to start with qualitative-based questions and criteria and then move to quantitative, just because quantifying things like emissions reductions, carbon sequestration and storage, as well as adaptation and resilience benefits is really a challenge. There's a lot of variability in the available data, tools, and process, which really makes it difficult to standardize and then compare benefits across projects. So if you're asking people to quantify, there's just different methodologies depending on habitat type. And Kathy just spoke to this a little bit in her presentation. And then the other challenge is just the applicants aren't necessarily going to have the capacity or expertise to proactively identify emissions reductions or sequestration potential, and then also to then identify what it is they need to monitor in order to track emissions and adaptation impacts and benefits over time. So one of the things we heard was really just having those qualitative descriptions of benefits or changes to projects might be an appropriate first step as the tools and data evolve for the quantitative estimates maybe coming a little bit later. Another thing that we heard was just thinking very carefully about the trade-offs that are associated with mitigation-based criteria. Again, this just came up in Kathy's presentation, but just the idea that some project activities release significant carbon, so prescribed fire or fuels reductions projects, and Brenda and Bruce, you just mentioned that presentation that you heard, but that ultimately prevents more carbon from being released in the future. And so how do you balance that when you're balance those trade-offs and when you're looking at mitigation-based criteria, for example, in evaluating these grant applications? Another thing related to mitigation in particular was just the idea around restoration equipment transitions and how challenging that will be, just because electric options for heavy equipment are either non-existent or incredibly limited and expensive. But people did recognize there may be emissions reductions opportunities, just thinking about ways to cut emissions in everyday tasks and projects, or purchasing less carbon intensive materials. And then when it came to adaptation, again, just that challenge with how do you quantify the benefits, so really thinking more qualitatively. And we also heard that when the resolution and the adaptation and resilience components really offers an opportunity for folks to re-examine potential project longevity or to look at their projects using that climate lens. So really thinking more about how long investments are going to be valid. Can we re-examine our current practices and modify them to better address climate impacts or become more efficient? And then also that there's a chance for new funding opportunities because mitigation and adaptation are gaining more momentum, that this, as folks are applying for OWEB grants and thinking, applying that climate lens, that it could be an opportunity for them to leverage funding from other sources, like the federal government, for example. And then just more specific to things like capacity and equity, there's a lot of input around applicant capacity and how much it varies. You know, different entities have different capabilities or capacity. There's going to be differences across the state depending on where you are, you know, just depending on the size of the organization, depending on where it's located, and that the climate mitigation and adaptation components are potentially new skills, and grant applicants are going to need that kind of information, guidance, trainings, and tools to respond and engage in these parameters effectively. And then just that there's a chance that some of those smaller underrepresented groups or just, you know, how that capacity varies might need more unique funding assistance with upfront funding to support better proposal development if people aren't necessarily able to, they don't necessarily have that capacity to do it yet. So how do we help get them there? And then the last thing that I'll mention is just that came up was the need to be flexible and think more, you know, broad about our evaluation criteria. And just because the climate science, the tools, the practices are really evolving and changing rapidly. So it's going to be important for us to, you know, revisit, update, revise, think about the need to make changes as we get more information, as we get information from our grant applicants as they're, you know, applying. So that flexibility is going to be important. So I'll stop there and see if there's anything that Eric Hartstein wants to share, and then we can turn it over to questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. And as Jesse said, there is a summary report that she pulled together that distills many, many hours of conversations into a really pithy document that it's fantastic. And that'll be available to the board here in a couple of weeks in advance of the July board meeting. The only other thing I would say is that the conversations that were had were really rich, fantastic, given the complexity of the topic. And I really just was just impressed, over the moon with the level of engagement that our stakeholders had on this topic.
Thank you. I see no hands up. Do you want to go to the communication part or the drought program?
Actually, there was one question that I had for Eric and Jesse, and that was, I think if you could just talk about overlap between the resolution and the feedback that you received, and are there any areas where you received feedback that aren't covered by the resolution? Just I was just taking a glance between the summary earlier this week and the resolution, and it seemed like there was a lot of the themes are really complementary between the two, and that was really encouraging to see. But was there anything that you didn't see reflected in the resolution that you heard in the listening sessions?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's some direct linkages between the resolution and what we heard in the listening sessions, and you will see that in the report that Jesse drafted as well. And I think those areas where it might be a little bit gray around things like flexibility, I think that is within the intent of the board in passing that climate resolution. But would be curious ultimately to hear what the board would have to say on those topics.
Okay, Jamie?
I was just going to ask, it was kind of similar to what Stephanie raised, but was there anything that you heard that surprised you that we hadn't been grappling with to date? Because we've talked about some of the unanticipated, some of the challenges, some of the things you raised were challenges that we had acknowledged or been at least aware of that they're coming, but anything that pop up that you hadn't heard the board talk about that we should be aware of?
For me, I think Oh, sorry, Eric.
Go ahead, Jesse.
I think, during the tribal listening session, I think there were some important points that came up just around cultural treaty rights and access to places, and how we need to be very, very cognizant of that when we are if we go through rulemaking, and how we pay attention to that and make sure that those kinds of rights aren't infringed upon. So just some challenges around, for example, like culturally valuable plants that get harvested, and if those fall under something that gets, is meant to be protected for carbon sequestration and storage, and it prevents access to harvesting those plants, for example. And so there were just, I would say, some interesting things that came up in the tribal session that I thought were just ones that we hadn't necessarily discussed before as part of the resolution, the different board meetings and things that maybe had come up very loosely, but there were some very specific points that came up in that session, I thought.
Yeah, and I was going to say the exact same thing. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks. Meg?
Thank you, Bruce. I guess this is for Jesse or Eric. Were there sectors, I guess, that you would like to have heard from that you didn't manage to, that you weren't able to reach, didn't get responses from? Anything along those lines?
I'd say, I'll start, Jesse, and you can fill in. We did have some contractors were at the listening sessions, but I think it would have been great to hear from more of them, because they're the ones that are actually implementing on the ground with the heavy equipment oftentimes. So we got a little bit of a flavor there, but it probably would have been useful to have even more input from that sector.
Yes, I would agree. I would agree with Eric. That was probably our group that we had fewer folks than maybe what we were hoping, but we still did get a handful. And just, I think what was really fascinating about the different listening sessions is that while there was a lot of overlap between the discussion points in the listening sessions, some had, for whatever reason, representatives that seemed to come from one sector in attendance, and so it would direct the conversation to cover that topic more richly, and it was really fun to get to do that. There was one session in particular, we had a lot of agricultural folks there, and we just spent a lot of time talking about agricultural practices and carbon sequestration and storage, and what this resolution means for things like that. And so it was really, and the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, and where there's opportunities with that. And so it was very interesting to see when we get that group, and how it would push the conversation in a little different direction than maybe what we'd heard in another listening session that was maybe more focused on, riparian restoration, for example.
Okay, thank you, both of you.
Seeing no more hands. Stephanie, what would you like to do?
Perfect. I think this is a great segue into agenda item number 4, if that's okay, Mr. Co-Chair. Communication, following up on the stakeholder and tribal engagement that you just heard about. So wanted to get the committee's thoughts about a follow-up communication from the board to the folks who participated in either the listening sessions or the one-on-one meetings or the survey, and just summarize the key themes that we heard during from that feedback. And then one possible additional point of communication could be resulting thoughts about the rules. I think the challenge would be, how do you avoid restating what's already in the resolution? But also, I think just making sure participants understand that they've been heard, and give them a sense of what the board took from the feedback that we've received.
Comments? Lindsay, you're smiling.
I am. I was just going to raise my hand. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Stephanie, for bringing that up. I think that's a really good idea. I think anytime anyone participates and provides feedback, sometimes that feedback loop isn't circled back and closed. And I think that, yeah, maybe the summary report that the board gets, or maybe a abbreviated version of that, but I think it would be very helpful, especially as we move into rulemaking and continue this conversation.
So Stephanie, are you anticipating having a draft of such a communique for the full board in next month? Is that the timeline you're looking at?
Yes. Yep. That's what I would propose. Yes.
Well, since we don't have a draft to look at today to really comment on, I will only make the comment that I think circling around makes perfect sense. But I think we have to make sure that we don't predetermine what's happening with RAC, nor do we incorporate anything in our response that would water down in any way or change the board resolution. So those things which are consistent, that we heard you, all that. So until we see a draft, that's the only comment I would have. Others? So there's no action. I'm assuming that people are happy with seeing a draft at the board meeting. Okay, seeing nods. Dan Shively, I can't see your nod, but I assume you are. Okay, Stephanie, do you want to do the drought?
Absolutely. Sounds great. Okay, switch notes here. So just to refresh everybody's memory, in the December 2021 special legislative session, OWEB received several drought programs. So this is a status report on the rollout of those different programs. And also, if there's interest, I could cover the post-wildfire recovery programs after the drought program update. So the first allocation of funding in the drought programs that OWEB received was $3 million to the Jefferson County Soil and Water Conservation District. That grant offering was stood up and closed. The Conservation District submitted an application. And so we're anticipating that a grant agreement should be in effect in July. So that one is moving along. And that was the first one that we prioritized and stood up. The next one was $3 million for Offstream livestock watering facilities in Klamath County. So the first grant cycle opened on May 31st and it closes June 30th, which that's tomorrow. So I just checked our database this morning and it looks like we've got 2 applications in progress currently for that offering. We are going to open a second grant cycle for that program in mid-July, and then that will close on September 1st. If there's funding remaining after the award of the grants from the second cycle, then we'll also open a third grant cycle in early November and close it in late December of this year. And our staff, I think as we've updated in the past, we've hired all the staff for these programs. They've done a great job networking with the Klamath Off-Channel Watering Work Group, which is a collection of partners that have been working on these types of projects, particularly in the Upper Basin, but not necessarily limited to there. So they've been in communication with them. And then we've also been in communication with one of the county commissioners who's offered to help with outreach. So just really appreciate the partnering and the help that we've received to help get the word out about that program. The next couple of programs are related to irrigation modernization. OWEB received $2 million for North Unit Irrigation District and then $1.62 million for statewide for irrigation modernization. And these are for matching grants for modernization projects. And typically they would receive the other source of match would be the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service PL 566 program. So we had anticipated opening the announcement for North Unit in mid-July. We're refining the timing based on the timing of the PL 566 planning process, the public engagement that is involved there. And we've been working very closely with North Unit to align those processes into lockstep. So that's an update on that one. And then the last two allocations that we received were $1 million each for Jefferson County and Klamath County for drought resiliency projects. We're anticipating opening grant cycles for both of those, both of the programs in both of those counties on September 1st. So before I cover the fire programs, I'll pause there and see if anybody has questions.
Stephanie, could you remind us what the Jefferson County Conservation District grant was for?
Absolutely. Those are for stewardship practices on irrigated land that's at a high risk for erosion and soil degradation. So I think we had heard concerns when folks weren't able to get a crop in about soil health issues and erosion issues. And so that's part of what that's for. And then also for noxious and invasive weed control in the county.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Meg?
Thank you, Bruce. Stephanie, the Jefferson and Klamath Drought Resiliency Projects, is that September 1st date driven by when we expect the need to arise, or is that just that is as fast as we can get this up and running kind of situation?
That's correct, Meg. It's the second, and that was really prioritizing the launch of the programs and when we thought we could get them stood up with the staff that we had and the guidance that we would need to put together, building the applications and all of that.
Yeah, that's a lot to stand up. And just one other question regarding the North Unit 2 million and the statewide money. Is that, you mentioned a public law that we're trying to coordinate the processes with. Is that creating a problem? I mean, is the timing creating a problem on the ground, to your knowledge? I mean, we can't control how the public law goes, but I'm just curious, what's happening on the ground with respect to that.
Yeah, I think part of what you might be asking is, could this cause us to run into the end of the biennium before the funds can be expended? Is that part of the concern?
Or that we have a need that's more immediate that we're not able to address, basically.
Okay. I'll tackle the North Unit one, and I think it's probably the same for prospective applicants for the statewide program as well. And the PL 566 program is basically, it's named after the public law that created it, but really it supports piping of irrigation canals for water conservation. That's really what the program does. And my understanding of it is limited, but basically it involves developing a watershed-wide plan of areas to be piped, conservation to be accomplished. And then, so as part of that process, there is a public comment period. And so in terms of, I think your question was, will the delay or will the alignment with the public comment process on the watershed plan possibly result in a delay? I would suspect that because the federal funding is providing a large chunk of the funding that is supporting this piping work, and then the funding that we're administering is an important part, but possibly a smaller percentage of the funding, that most of the project work is going to take place following the public comment period anyway, just because that has to happen for the federal funding to be available.
Okay. So it's just a process that has to run its course in order to get all the funding lined up. And it would take time. I mean, well, okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. And I will say we may have additional updates on this at the full board meeting. We've been engaging pretty extensively with the district just to make sure that we're getting this right and operating in lockstep. So we may have additional updates even just a couple of weeks from now.
Okay, thanks.
Jamie.
Yeah, I both appreciate Meg's sense of urgency, but also per our last discussion, I'm assuming in the project proposal, there's discussions with a tribal community in this case, and the need to make sure that we're recognizing the appropriate and taking the appropriate steps for consultation as a project is being anticipated and discussed rather than after the fact, because that's often feedback we've heard from tribal communities is a frustration with not being brought to the table initially. So it's my understanding that at least one of the ideas that's being discussed by the North Unit Irrigation District does involve Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And so just want to flag and make sure that that's kind of, I think, the balance, Meg, of both trying to move quickly on something that there's a desperate need for, but also making sure that that consultation process takes place in the appropriate manner. And we're learning from past feedback and making sure we're having a strong upfront conversation while a project is being anticipated and developed and thought through.
Thanks, Jamie. Stephanie?
Great. All right. I will transition to talking about the fire grant solicitations now. So we had hired just a few weeks ago a staff person for the fire grant program. And Renee Davis is also in a position related to Klamath drought and fire programs. But since she's now got a team of staff working under her, we also, of course, wanted to fill the fire position that we received for the 2021 fire grant. So one of our in-house staff successfully applied for that position. We are really excited to have her in that role. And so she's been working with Renee on standing up the 2021 post-fire recovery offering. The 2021 post-fire recovery offering has an anticipated launch date of September 1st of this year. So that one is coming. And then stepping a little further back in time, I'll talk for a minute about the grants for the 2020 post-fire recovery offerings. We've, from the first round of applications that we had, we've allocated about $5 million of funding across three fire areas. And that's either reflected in grant agreements that are already finalized or in agreements that are pending. We had a second grant cycle that closed on May 31st, and we received about $3 million in requests across 7 fire areas. I've got the areas if anybody wants them, but I won't rattle them off for now. And then we are going to open a third post-fire recovery grant cycle for both the replanting and the floodplain restoration and reconnection grants, and that will be open from August 1st to 31st. And then we'll, I think, gather feedback from folks and see what we've got left after that grant cycle, and then assess whether we should do further grant offerings. One thing that I wanted to mention with regard to all of the programs that I've updated you on today is that we do hear from local partners that they're really stretched with regard to capacity, and that in some cases is limiting or preventing folks from applying for the grant funds. And it was interesting, there was a legislative update during legislative days a few weeks ago from multiple partners working on different aspects of fire resiliency and recovery. And capacity was a theme that other speakers brought up as well. I think someone from OSU was speaking about fire resiliency work, and they mentioned the local organization capacity challenge. So I think that there have been, or I guess there have been some cases where we didn't receive the number of applications that we thought we would, or we heard from prospective applicants that they just aren't ready. And so, we may end up with more offerings than we initially anticipated, just because we still have funding available. And then one final thing I'll mention, and we'll talk to the board about this at the July board meeting when we talk about the 23 to 25 agency request budget, is that we are planning to request carryover for any unspent drought grant funds, and then B, unspent post-fire recovery funds. When we received the post-fire funding allocations, we were very clear that it was very unlikely they would be spent by the end of the biennium, and that we fully expected to have carryover. So we will be requesting that.
Thanks, Stephanie. Questions? All right. Well, that brings us to item 2, which is also the last item. And it says we are to discuss committee priorities and intersectionality between committees. The committee members with climate, water, DEI, and the other 2, DEI and grants committee. So I will open it up for comments, questions. I made some notes if it would help start. I looked at under climate, water priorities, under the climate resolution, the need for guidance for grantees, whether or not, to what degree we want to emphasize co-benefits. The issue of metrics and monitoring tools remains. I'm very curious what Brenda has to say about moving, if not exclusively, at least heavily towards qualitative. We have DEI talking about project aggregating, how we can help incentivize community project partnerships with coordination with soil water conservation and SWCDs. Determining where our most vulnerable communities are. We mentioned it in the climate resolution, but how do we go about determining the location and the makeup of those communities? The grants committee, there's been a lot of talk about the climate resolution and restoration grants, but where the climate, water and climate committee expect the climate resolution to have application across the board to all of our types of grants, and how we would expect that to work, or what recommendations we might have on small grants. And organizational collaboration seems to be a big one, and capacity. Board priorities and the FIP evaluation. I noticed that on our focused investment partnership application evaluation, item number 7 talks about evaluation criteria. A is extent to which initiative addresses a board priority, and all of them have NA, not applicable. And that's so, and I'm not sure exactly why, and that's not a big issue, except that when you do have a board priority such as a climate resolution, how do we address it over and above the questioning? And I know these are all items we're working on, but there's certainly, I think, discussion for how the committee feels we should move forward on it. So those are just some notes that I had. Brenda.
Bruce, my apologies. I obviously am falling behind here, but could you explain your comment about the qualitative metrics?
Well, there was the comments that were made both by Catherine Mcdonald, although she never used those terms. She just talked about metrics. But then as later on, Jesse and maybe Eric were talking about, whether we should just go initially start with qualitative because we're not set or it's changing too much. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Are you unmuting, Gary?
Okay. My little unmute is right up the top. Sometimes it pops down, sometimes it doesn't. So just on this issue of community vulnerability for a minute, Bruce. I just wonder, as you're talking about that, how we're going to, as you said, how we're going to identify that, and just some thoughts I have. Well, I mean, how are we going to talk about community vulnerability just in terms of human populations and the demographics of that, or is it? And how big is this community going to be? And is there other parts of that besides just the human element that's going to go into deciding the vulnerability of what we're trying to identify here? So just for discussion, I guess.
Great question, Gary. Comments? Kelly? Lindsay? Dan's? Kelly?
Yeah. I actually have a comment not related to that, but I think it's a great question, Gary. I think that, I don't know, I want to say that's TBD, right? As we move forward with things, as far as the kind of the scope and scale of things. But I think it's important that we include kind of everything, right? I mean, it ties back to the OWEB mission and vision as well, right? That, it's not just the plant communities or the animal communities, it's the human communities too, and their connection to the landscape, right? And we're all part of it. So I think, we look at it holistically as the community kind of in general, including all of those things, which is a pretty big net to cast, right? But that's just kind of how I see it. And then I can save my other comment if other folks want to chime in on this one specifically.
Dan? Dan chime.
Hey, yep, thanks, Bruce. Sorry, not used to these Zoom controls. Hey, folks, I had some thoughts, and maybe this would help get people thinking down this path. To Gary's point, there's a group, and I was searching for it here, of Forest Service scientists that have put together an approach to evaluating, basically developing a social vulnerability index that includes a smattering and variety of different and available data that has to do with socioeconomics, minority status and language, household types, transportation is a part of it, household composition and disability. It gets at all these social vulnerability factors, and I don't have a full understanding of it, but it's a means in which this mapping can then be overlaid, parlayed onto the landscape, looking at important areas in need of post-fire recovery or preventative wildfire risk reduction work. It could even be, priority watershed restoration work. It could be whatever lens one would like to put on that, and then being able to look through mapping exercises and applying these indices, model development, to identify, where those areas may be, where might the benefiting communities lie on the landscape. And a Forest Service researcher by the name of Lee Cerveny down out of Corvallis, Oregon, has been instrumental in this work. She's not the only one, but perhaps if it would benefit the committee and folks are receptive to a short presentation, at least to expose folks to some of the work already developed around this. I'm not suggesting or endorsing that work, but I think it would help stimulate the conversation for folks to take this discussion to the next level. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Dan. Kelly, you want to get back to your second point?
Sure, it's going to take us a little off track, but kind of in thinking about sort of the intersection of all the different committees, I think we're going to have that overlap for a while. I know as far as the DEI committee goes, and we had discussed this previously, our hope is that eventually we won't have to have a DEI committee because we'll just be incorporating DEI into everything that we do, right? Just naturally, and sort of folding that in. And so I think there's going to be a lot of overlap right now between DEI, this committee, and the grants committee for sure. And I can see that too with the grants committee, just because, everything we do is so intertwined. So I think, the reforming of these committees is still relatively new and we're learning as we go. But from what I've seen so far, I think there's been really good incorporation and discussion of things that affect the different committees, or maybe a primary for one committee, but definitely overlap with another. I think the staff's been doing a really good job of bringing those components in to the different committee meetings and helping us kind of see what's going on with the other committees, and just having sort of some of that repetition is really helpful, I think, for folks. And I think is going to be helpful moving forward as well. So from what I'm seeing, I think it's working pretty well right now. But I think this might be an ongoing discussion for us as we evolve as committees.
Thanks, Kelly. Lindsay.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties with my camera. But just wanted to think a little bit about some of our priorities for the Climate and Water Committee with the climate resolution, and thinking about how that kind of translates into on the ground practical applications, and then questions in grant applications, and thinking that I also sit on the grants committee. I know Dan Brown does too. And I would, one of the priorities for me would be to have ongoing communication between those two committees, whether that's a combined meeting as we workshop things, or volunteering myself, not necessarily Dan, but would take help on being a liaison between the two committees and helping. I'm still new to OWEB and not really sure how the RAC's going to go, what all that entails, but certainly, we have priorities for this committee under the resolution, and then, looking at the grants committee to put that into play, definitely would be a priority for me to kind of keep this item on the agenda and keep talking about it as it sort of
forms. Just some thoughts.
Thanks, Lindsay. I think it's relatively easy to see the magnitude of things like as we address climate and the work that was done on the resolution. The DEI issues seem to me to be not quite as clear cut, but as equally of magnitude, mainly because for me that for years, OWEB has been so focused on projects related, all going back to land ownership. Land ownership was an important part of OWEB. Those are how we identified projects through soil and water conservation districts and all of our partnerships. But when we start getting into DEI and vulnerable communities, ownership becomes a question. And then how do we as a board address vulnerable communities, cultural, all of the identified, without land ownership, and how we see a aggregation and how do we incentivize partnerships to go to the non-ownership vulnerable communities, non-land ownership. So I'm excited about how that works forward. And I think climate is a good nexus for DEI and the grants committee. So I'm excited about it. Stephanie, you had a question or comment?
I did have, and this is a topic change, so I don't want to, if there are additional comments on this topic, I'll hold on for just a second. Okay. Brenda, do you want to go ahead and then I can close after you?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, it is related to Bruce's comment, and I think that's an excellent point, Bruce, that if we look at the demographics of people who own the land with whom we work, it does not necessarily represent, I'd be surprised if it represented the demographics of Oregonians as a whole. And so it strikes me that there are kind of different layers of information that we need here. We have these sessions where we listen to stakeholders and others engaged in the projects that we fund. But the projects that we fund have implications for people who don't own land and who are not part of that process. And so I think it would be helpful from a DEI and a climate and a water perspective to understand better some of the views of all Oregonians broken down by demographic sector so that we have a better understanding of what the priorities are for all Oregonians, not a subset of them.
Thanks, Brenda. Stephanie?
Before we wrapped up today, I wanted to mention some quick possible topics for the full board meeting in October. And I wanted to mention it to this committee because I think it's something we've talked about as possible future committee topics. But the topics do seem like they could be of interest to the full board. So just wanted your perspective on that. Some of the possibilities for the full October board meeting could be some topics really focused on water. The statewide water table that's been going on, the state and tribal water table that has had a couple of meetings now, total maximum daily load, water quality priorities, Klamath Dam removal, and OWEB's role and update on that. So I think we've talked about having those here, but just thought that the October board meeting might be a great opportunity to cover several of those topics, and they might be of interest to the full board.
It's a good idea.
Okay.
No objections or comments, Meg, Jamie?
No objections. I think it's a great idea. I just wanted to follow up on Dan's idea of, part of what we're learning to do is the how and see things and understand things to expand our thinking around DEI issues to the comments made So the social vulnerability factors or indicators, I think some of that as an ongoing training and bringing that into the committee level, board level, however we bring that in, I think that's a great suggestion, and encourage us to follow up on that in some way. And then I think going back to Kelly's point, it's my understanding that the discussion of the priorities and intersectionality between committees is a standing item on this agenda. And so that I feel very strongly about that. So if we can keep that so that we can continue those discussions. So thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie and Bruce, and my apologies. I've got another meeting I'm going to have to cut and run. I'll follow up with Lee and see if she and her colleagues would be available, and we can figure out the details of the what, where, and how at some point in the future. Stephanie, to your point on the topics for October, I really like that. I would suggest that we might also include in that list of topics water source protection. We're seeing a premier emphasis on that at the federal level, and I think that wraps down nicely to the state level. And I'm seeing Dan Brown nod. He knows what I mean. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. So you're okay, Stephanie? Yep. I would like, I'm going to do a quick poll as individuals on the committee find resources, articles, webinars, etc. Does anybody have any objection to being notified of those on a mailing? I mean, we all get way too many emails and things, but I want to feel comfortable that everybody's okay getting information distributed. Thank you for all your hard work, Stephanie. Jamie?
Bruce, if I may, we haven't had public comment, and I know we are essentially out of time and over time, but did want to see if there was, even if we don't have public comment in this, if the staff can just give, say a word or two about how members of the public could weigh in on these committee meetings so that going forward, we have that opportunity. And sorry for jumping in, Bruce, but I thought that was an important.
That's perfect, Jamie. Thank you.
Great. I'll let April jump in if we did receive any public comment. So basically we've, when we post the agenda and send out the Gov delivery about the committee meeting, we explain where folks can send written comments. They can send those comments to April Mac. And we ask that folks submit those by 4 p.m. 2 days before the committee meeting, and then ask that folks sign up if they want to provide verbal comment by 4 p.m. on 2 days before the board meeting. And I see that April's emailed me. So, okay. Oh yeah, and she mentioned that notice goes out with the agenda.
Can people comment on YouTube?
They, not while the meeting is going on in a way that the committee can receive it. No, they do need to sign up in advance and a couple of days in advance.
Okay.
Oh. Okay. Oh. Hold on just a second. Okay.
Anything for the good of the order? Stephen? Okay. Thank you, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you all in person in next month. If not, be there in spirit. Thank you.